Hi, I'm Michael Hayden. If you're watching this video, you're probably missing this year's film identification workshop as much as I am. Thankfully, Mostly Lost 9 is only postponed until next year. This presentation focuses on an obscure piece of movie history, similar to other presentations given at Mostly Lost over the years. It even concludes with 3 under-identified comedies, but it is by no means a substitute for the actual event. What makes Mostly Lost work is the energy and enthusiasm that a theater full of knowledgeable people bring to the task of identifying a few minutes of film that is missing its release title. One suggestion that instantly prompts another. A wrong name that's called out, leading to the right one. That energy and enthusiasm could never be replicated without being there. So, as we wait for 2021 and the return of the real thing, here's a little tale about film collecting. Hopefully you'll find it informative. Hopefully you'll get a few laughs out of it. Hopefully the 3 under-identifieds are not so obscure and exist in more complete form in one of the many archives that participate in the Mostly Lost workshops. And hopefully I'll see you all next year at Mostly Lost 9. Until then, stay safe and happy viewing. When I interviewed David Shepard for my book Chaplin's Vintage Year, he asked if I had been a collector, and I told him that I'd purchased 8mm gauge films since pre-adolescence. He said that he went straight into 16mm because, quote, it was much more likely that I'd come across something rare or unusual. And I thought to myself, clearly you've never been a customer of Atlas Films. I'm Michael J. Hayden, and this is the story of 8mm collecting for the financially impaired. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll look at the origins of Atlas and another company, Carnival Films, discuss some of their offerings, and conclude with 3 short reels of under-identified vintage silent comedy. Anyone who collected film from the 1950s forward knows that Black Hawk Films of Davenport, Iowa was the gold standard. Founder Kent D. Easton went to great lengths to locate and license classic material from the silent era, including the outright purchase of Chaplin's 12 mutual comedies some 20 years after the films had lapsed into public domain. Black Hawk even published a monthly catalog, the Black Hawk Bulletin, that collectors looked forward to nearly as much as the films themselves. Atlas, on the other hand, was literally the dollar bin of 8mm. For $1, you could get 50 feet of old-time comedy or cartoon. And if the picture quality wasn't exactly pristine, it was still better than nothing. Licensing rights and sourcing first-generation preprint material wasn't an overriding concern for this outfit. If they could get hold of it, they'd put it out. Consequently, Atlas had stuff that Black Hawk didn't, but nearly all of it seemed to be about 1,100 generations removed from the original camera negative. I owned some Black Hawk prints, but they were always gifts. 2 things mitigated against me being a steady Black Hawk customer and also made Atlas an attractive option. First, I never had a lot of money, whether it was 50 cents per week allowance as a kid, or paper route money, or whatever. I had to put half of it in a savings account toward college. Second, as Lisa's photo perfectly captures, I have a tragically short attention span. So 50-foot reels were perfect. In and out, then thread up the next one. Incidentally, that's another reason why Mostly Lost is my favorite film event. Even movies about paving Michigan don't last very long. I used to order from Atlas by mail, and that package from New York City was every bit as exciting as one from Davenport, Iowa. In a way, it was even more exciting because if Atlas was out of a title you had ordered, they would send something else. I'll have more about that in a few minutes. First, let's get to the big question. What is the Atlas Films backstory? That topic has been raised on a few 8mm collectors forums and news groups over the years. No one there has a definite answer, but there have been bad guesses and always a few interesting anecdotes. Querying Atlas Films in Google or Lantern isn't much help because there have been several such companies over the years. Luckily, I had saved an envelope from May 1973, As you can see, this IDs the company as Atlas Incorporated. So, when I searched that name, bingo! From here, the New York State Department of Corporations provided additional detail. As you can see, Atlas began as Metro Films Incorporated on May 12, 1960. For whatever reason, maybe MGM had some say in it, the name was changed to Atlas Films just 10 months later. Finally, in December 1971, it became Atlas Incorporated, which it remained until the company was legally dissolved 20 years later. Sterex was a brand of blank cassette tapes that could be had for 49 cents apiece at drug and department stores. The company also marketed a mini slide viewer, presumably for mini slides. As Black Hawk Films had Kent Easton of Illinois, Atlas Films had Kermit Frankel of Brooklyn. Mr. Frankel has an interesting history. Per the 1940 census, he was born in New York in 1911 and was living in his mother-in-law's home with his wife and their young son, and working as a shipping clerk for a dress factory. The address, 1793 East 17th Street, is the same one provided to the Department of Corporations 20 years later. By 1958, Mr. Frankel was working at a photo laboratory supply house. We know this because on July 31st of that year, he was indicted as a member of a pornography ring. This was an especially pernicious bunch. It included 5 women who'd been around that block a few times, plus at least one doctor who was secretly photographing his female patients as they disrobed. All 4 defendants pleaded not guilty, and the lawyer for one of them got the charges dismissed on a technicality. Reflecting on this narrow escape, Mr. Frankel evidently decided that pornography was not a wise career choice and opted instead for a quiet life of film piracy. Meanwhile, just across the Hudson River in Lodi, New Jersey, Robert James Astore founded Carnival Films Incorporated on October 14, 1960, 5 months after Mr. Frankel launched Metro Films. Born in 1936, Mr. Astore was also the president of Bergen Film Laboratories, housed at the same Lodi address. He took over this position from his father, Anthony Astore, earlier that same year. By all accounts, Robert Astore was a model businessman. In 1962, he even went to the expense of registering his company's logo as a trademark, something Kermit Frankel never did. And you'll be pleased to know extensive research has failed to turn up any instance where Mr. Astore was arrested for pornography. Unfortunately, the same is not true of his father. Unlike Mr. Frankel, Anthony Astore was convicted for his part in processing and transporting 8mm and 16mm films of a lewd and lascivious nature from his lab in Lodi to New York City. The senior Astore was sentenced in August 1960, and 2 months later, his son launched Carnival Films. So, keeping in mind the many times that film in an Atlas box had Carnival opening titles on it, let's sum up. We have a New Yorker working at a film laboratory supply company that started a home movie business in 1960. We have a New Jersey man running a film laboratory that started a home movie business in 1960. Each business offered the exact same library, comedies, westerns, and cartoons, mostly from the silent and early sound eras. In the 16 months prior to that, the New Yorker was arrested for possessing and distributing pornographic photos and movie film. And the father of the New Jersey man was arrested for processing pornographic movies and photos at his lab and transporting them to New York. What are the odds that these guys knew each other? It's just speculation, but the 2 likeliest scenarios: either Atlas did its processing at Bergen Film Labs and Frankel and Astore scratched each other's backs, or they were 2 pirates who pirated each other's inventory. Complicating this tale is the existence of 2 other companies, Apollo and Coast. Neither business appears to have been incorporated, and since both are Brooklyn-based, it's possible they existed prior to the establishment of Metro Films, perhaps set up by Mr. Frankel and his shady associates as side businesses. Another possibility is that one or both were small operators that were bought out by Frankel to form the basis for his company. The offerings are exactly the same, although based on that Chaplin caricature, they might have been selling Billy Ritchie comedies. There's also a mystery, Coronet Films Incorporated. As any boomer who attended elementary school knows, Coronet mainly produced educational films. It began in Chicago, but when it became part of the Prentice Hall family, was incorporated in New York City in 1968. Peter Jovanovich, later one-third of Harcourt Brace Jovanovich Publishing, was listed as the CEO. Did Coronet enter the home movie business long after Atlas was up and running, using Atlas artwork? Probably not, when we consider that, prior to 1968, there was a film processing laboratory in Queens also called Coronet Films Incorporated. We know this because on September 29, 1967, it was raided, along with a second processing plant. The same man, Louis Sachs of Brooklyn, owned both. The article says the two labs could turn out 30,000 200-foot reels per day. Did Atlas use them for its processing? Did Louis Sachs and Kermit Frankel know each other? There are no answers, but as with Carnival, it was possible to buy an Atlas film that opened with Coronet titles. Now I'd like to share some personal experience as an Atlas customer. I mentioned that I usually bought the 50-foot reels. I bought this Our Gang title, House of Mystery, and my friends and I were delighted that it was the last few minutes of Moan and Groan Incorporated, one of the Little Rascals shorts that had been taken off television only a couple of years earlier, the one with Max Davidson and Edgar Kennedy. It was silent and scratchy, but we still remembered it from TV and enjoyed it. So, with some birthday gift money, I ordered the 200-foot version. When it came, the box said Part 1, which was odd since the flyer didn't say anything about parts. But hey, it was the first half, which wasn't part of the 50-foot reel, so I threaded it up. This is what I saw. Yes, it's the Silent Our Gang spook spoofing, duped from Blackhawk's print. At that point, I had never seen a Silent Our Gang, but this one justly has a reputation for being the least enjoyable film in the series because of the mistreatment of Farina throughout. Incidentally, that odd coloring on the opening title was an experiment, as was this. The films were so cheap, I had no problem with using them to experiment with such things as tinting. And I learned a valuable lesson, namely that if you add a layer of anything to 8mm, the projector gate is likely to scratch the hell out of the emulsion. I also learned that some colors work better than others. Sometimes there were neat little surprises on an Atlas reel. One of the reasons there is a Mostly Lost is that opening titles are so often missing. When something like this shows up on a home movie, it reveals a little film history. W.H. Productions reissued over 100 Keystone comedies between 1917 and 1919. By then, Mack Sennett was releasing through Paramount. It's interesting to see the lengths that W.H. went through to make this 4-year-old film seem new. You'll notice the former title is in much smaller print and not underlined like the new one. Above that, the name Keystone is mostly covered over by the phrase Mack Sennett Comedies, which was how new Sennett releases were marketed. Cast credits were nearly as fragile as opening titles. The Keystones that were released through the ill-fated Triangle Corporation often didn't get the distribution they deserved, and were also later reissued under other company names. Seeing an original Triangle credit card has of course been helpful in the restoration of these comedies. In an attempt to assemble a fairly complete version of Chaplin's 1 a.m., I took a chance and ordered a title called Sleepless Night, hoping it would be from Reel 2. It wasn't. Okuda and Maska's book, Charlie Chaplin at Keystone and Essanay, listed as a cut-down of Caught in the Rain. It's not that, either. Here's about 90 seconds of what it was.
Yes, it's payday, which was totally illegal to have at the time. As you can see, the decomp from the original source is printed in, so somebody somewhere had secured a vintage print, and it just got duped and reduped all the way to Lodi. I did do a side-by-side viewing of this film with the version on the Image DVD, and the takes were identical. Of course, the poor quality of the 8mm made it impossible to determine if the camera positioning was different, but the takes used were definitely the same. In fact, other than image quality, there was only one difference between the two versions. And I throw this out there for the benefit of all the purists in the audience. As I mentioned earlier, Atlas's mail order was just as sketchy as their business model. If they were out of what you ordered, they'd send whatever they had on hand. The 3 films you're about to see are from that subset. First up, Slim Somerville in The Wrestlers. Slim rightfully gets top billing in this cutdown, but this is from Larry Darmour's Barney Google series, which starred Barney Hellum, who doesn't get a single close-up here. Next up, Oh You Nurse. This stars Bobby Dunn and is probably the 1924 Arrow comedy I'm Cured, but of course we'd love to have that confirmed. This is probably a good time to remind you that friends of Mostly Lost do not endorse this content. We just like to laugh at it. Finally, Al Cook, whose last name should have an E at the end, in Hey Taxi. This is another Darmour production from a series that teamed Cook with Barney Hellam, but the comedy load here is carried by a cross-eyed taxi driver. The chase draws to a close, and the blurry shadows of Al Cook and Barney Hellam pedal down a heavily duped country road of long, long ago. And we say farewell to Atlas Films. May we never see their fuzzy, splotchy like again. Like many a New York businessman, Kermit Frankel retired to Florida and died in Palm Beach at age 76 on October 13, 1987. Robert Astori appears to also have moved to Florida, and with no evidence of having passed away, is hopefully a hale and hearty 83 years of age. These two guys, in their way, helped form and feed the hunger for silent comedy among future enthusiasts. Print quality and rights issues aside, they made it possible for Chaplin, Keaton, Laurel and Hardy, our gang, and others to affordably enhance children's birthday parties and sleepovers. In the process, they even gave us comedies and comedians that weren't well known enough for art houses, PBS, or the Black Hawk Bulletin. I'd say that's not such a bad legacy. My sincere thanks to those listed for providing films, images, music, and general encouragement, and thank you for watching. And for those of you who noticed this headline earlier, here's the article that went with it.